Gemini Man Part 2, The Hunting Dogs, Chapter 5. The theater led out into the brisk Moscow fall night. As was a century-old tradition, the audience lingered on the marble steps, clustered around the Corinthian columns, criticizing the performance they'd just seen. And as tradition demanded, whether the performance was good or bad, tonight's had been particularly good. They found some flaw in it. "Can you believe the colors they chose for that woman's dress?" one man said with disdain. "The neckline," an older woman called. "You can almost fully see her breasts." "If she had any worth looking at," a man added smugly. Vitenka shook his head as he worked his way across the portico. Whether the revolution came or went, he thought, Muscovites remained the same. He approached a group of his friends, the men in uniform, the women in expensive, for Russia, dresses. "I wonder if the playwright really knows anything about life in Catherine's court," one of the young men was saying. "Weren't the gowns delicious?" one of the women added. Vitenka laughed. Certainly the women in them were. One of the women playfully hit him in the shoulder. "You were supposed to be watching the play, not the little—" "Watch your language, my angel," Vitenka interrupted. "Actresses in it." They all laughed. Vitenka turned, looking over the slowly departing crowd. As the conversation began to drift away from the play and onto which discotheques to visit, he suddenly froze. "Excuse me, I'll be right back." His friends barely noticed him leave. He walked across the portico and down a few steps to a man standing by himself, sipping from a cup of steaming cider. "Colonel Ruinoff." The man looked up from his cup. "Ah," he said after a few moments. "Medverov's errand boy. Let me see." He paused. "Major Vitenka, wasn't it?" "It still is," Vitenka said as they shook hands. "It has been too long a time, sir." Ruinoff looked the man over. "Not so long." 3 months, sir." Ruinoff nodded. "How are you, Major? Still scurrying around for Medverov?" "Essentially." A difficult silence settled between the men. "Sir," Vitenka finally said, "if you recall, when last we met it was under somewhat, difficult circumstances." "An interesting phrase, Major." Vitenka took a deep breath. "We both had our orders, sir, and we carried them out as best we could." Ruinoff took a long drink, holding his face over the steaming cup for an extra moment or two. "I'm sure that will be comforting to Bronsky's widow and 3 children." Vitenka moved a step closer. "Was it ever proven that Newman actually did it?" The tone of his voice was compelling enough to force Ruinoff to look up into the man's eyes. "To me," he said in a low voice, "it was proven to me, to my satisfaction." Vitenka nodded slowly, not exactly sure why. "I informed the general of the incident, but he insisted that we follow through on the release." He paused. "But I took all possible precautions." Ruinoff laughed bitterly. "With that man, that is an impossibility." He lit a cigarette as he tossed the remnants of his cider in a nearby can. "What we did, Major, you, me, Medvedev, was to release a plague into the world. And I assure you, when the time of judgment comes—" He drew a lungful of smoke from the cigarette and held it for long moments before exhaling the bluish cloud. "And it will come, I assure you. On that day before God, we will be called to task for that action." He took deep drags on his cigarette. As Vitenka stared into Ruinoff's darkly circled eyes, his expression of tired cynicism, a question which had plagued him since he turned Newman over to the American, suddenly found its voice. "Colonel?" Ruinoff looked up at the earnest young man. "What is it now?" Vitenka looked around, checking to see that no one was within earshot. "Sir, I am also afraid of that final judgment." He looked at the older man. "I did my duty, to my general, to my country. But if that act were to cause what you believe, would I—" His voice trailed off, and it took a moment for him to pull himself back from the nightmare that often invaded his nights. "Then I know it will be, at least in part, my fault." Ruinoff seemed to be studying him intently. "Your point, Major?" "Sir," Vitenka began slowly, "as a soldier, as a man, I must ask." He took a deep breath. "Has he—" "I can guarantee you, Major," Ruinoff said in a low voice, that since his release, Newman has caused no harm. You can guarantee? Runoff nodded. Since his release, he has been kept under the strictest of security at a sanitarium near Munich, Germany. And for the last 3 months, he has been kept in an escape-proof underground cell. He paused. He has harmed no one. In fact, his doctors believe he is well on his way to recovery. You know this? Vitinka said with a strain of incredulity in his voice. I do. Verified? Runoff nodded slightly. I have caused certain, shall we say, checks to be put in place. Old comrades from Afghanistan, now in control of certain networks in the West, have, indulged an old man. He chuckled bitterly. My information, however, is authoritative. One of Vitinka's friends waved for him to join them. He held up a patient hand. And he is near a cure. Thank goodness, Vitinka mumbled in relief. Runoff shook his head. The man cannot be cured, Major. Evil is not a disease. Nevertheless, sir. Runoff interrupted him. Good evening, Major. He crushed out his cigarette, then quickly started down the steps, and in his heart prepared for his inevitable damnation. In the heart of Bavaria, standing on the roof of the main building of the Institute, another man contemplated eternity. He looked up at the same stars as Runoff, equally concerned about the sins of this world, passing on to the next. But unlike the Russian colonel, Jack Clemente was thinking less about Newman and more about himself. I thought I'd find you up here, Patricia said as she came through the stairway door. She took several deep breaths. Why can't you, communing in the garden like everybody else? Save me the trip up those damn stairs. He ignored her, just continued staring at the stars. Jack, she asked cautiously, you okay? He turned, smiling at her. In what sense? Patricia visibly relaxed. Don't start. She walked over to him. Meetings in 10 minutes. Jack nodded. I know. Patricia looked up at the brilliant display of stars. My goodness. Jack nodded. Exactly what I was thinking, he said as he perched on the railing. A fit of coughing came over him, doubling the frail man over. Patricia started to rush over to him, but he held up a hand to stop her. For 2 full minutes he hacked and coughed, each jolt shaking his body like a rag doll. Finally it passed. He stood up, wiping a dribble of blood from his mouth. Could you? He croaked out, gesturing at a thermos. Patricia quickly poured him a glass of what appeared to be apple juice. She started to hand it to him, but noticing how badly his hands were shaking, she held it up to his lips. He took a small sip, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small gold metal pillbox. He fumbled with the top, opening it and pulling out one of the large pills inside. He popped it in his mouth as Patricia again held the cup to his lips. After a moment, he waved it away, smiling weakly at her. Thank you. Patricia desperately wished she had within her the bedside manners or natural tact that all her colleagues seemed to possess in abundance. What are you taking? Was all she could think to say. Dilaudid. For how long? She asked in a hushed voice. Dilaudid was one of the most powerful painkillers available. Doctors prescribed it primarily in untreatable cancer cases. About a month, maybe 6 weeks, Jack said, his voice gradually regaining its former strength. I don't know what to say, she stammered out. I'm sorry. Jack smiled. Truly one of the most eloquent and mercifully succinct statements I've heard lately. He paused, straightening himself, in one of the few whose sentiments I believe. Thank you. Are you up to this meeting? He nodded. I'm not exactly at death's door, not yet at least. He took the cup from her and drank. Noticing the pained expression on Patricia's face, he reached out and took her hand. You came up here for a reason? She nodded, tight-lipped. Go ahead, Jack urged. I promise not to die on you. Not right now, at any rate. A lot of people, perhaps most, would have been shocked at his joke. Patricia just laughed. It was a strained laugh, but genuine, from the heart. I wanted to talk with you before we went down. He leaned back on the railing. So, talk. She hesitated, drew strength from his supportive smile, then jumped in. Why do you think Tabert's called this meeting? Other than to hear himself talk, you tell me. Patricia started to pace. I see 2 possibilities, she began. You're beginning to sound like Newman. She paused, turning back to him. When I figure out whether that's a compliment or a put-down, I'll respond with a biting reply. She thought for a moment. First possibility as head of the Institute. He wants an in-depth progress report on how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Logical, reasonable, and the avowed purpose for the show. But I don't believe it, she said, resuming her pacing. I agree with you. Which leaves us, she said slowly, with the second possibility. She stopped, turning back to him. He has something up his sleeve. Jack walked over to the thermos, pouring himself another glass of juice. Undoubtedly, and I think I have a pretty good idea what it is. Patricia walked over, taking a drink out of the thermos. So give. You're an analyst, he chided, a trained observer. Examine the behavior, the circumstances, the setting. Take into account your profile of the man, your knowledge of the project. Then answer your own question. All sympathy was gone but from her face, replaced by a deeply annoyed look. I don't need lessons on clinical technique or office politics 10 minutes before the meeting. Jack raised his eyebrows. Don't you? Patty, there are a heck of a lot of tabards out there. You better learn how to deal with them sooner rather than later. He rubbed his forehead as he fought off a spasm of gut-wrenching pain. Think. Why now? Why today? Why 9 o'clock at night? Patricia was so taken up with concentrating that she didn't notice Jack slip another pill into his mouth. Today, she mumbled, tonight. She paused, head down, walking slowly back and forth. Suddenly, she stopped and stood bolt upright. Damn! Jack nodded. I think your clouds are beginning to clear. When does Beck get back? She answered her own question. Tomorrow, right? He gets back tomorrow with the review board from Washington. She paused. Taber's decided to take over the presentation. Exactly. He's going to play his little corporal show of I'm in charge, I know it all, and then either kill or extend the project, depending on what he hears tonight. He'll kill it, Patricia said sadly. You know that. The sickly man straightened, picked up the thermos, and walked over to her, putting his arm around her shoulders. Unless we, meaning you, can convince him otherwise. Me? She looked shocked. He hates me. Barely listens to anything I have to say, even when it's what he wants to hear. Jack began leading her toward the stairs. Then make him listen. How? He smiled a crooked smile. Think of him as a patient, a man who is convinced that he's perfectly sane despite all evidence to the contrary. As his analyst, you must convince him of his psychosis. You're getting at something, she said suspiciously. Am I? He said, as he opened the door for her. Well, she said as she helped him down the stairs, he is damn close to being a paranoid narcissist. As they paused for breath at a landing, Jack patted her on the shoulder. And what is the most effective way of communicating with a paranoid narcissist? Patricia thought for a moment. Analogy? The old man shook his head and smiled. Actually, I would have gone with flattery first. Patricia shrugged. I won't flatter that man. Another shrug and a smile. Then, Jack said as he started down the stairs again, I suggest you go with your first instinct. For example, she asked as she caught up with him, tell him about the pigeon. 15 minutes later, they sat around the conference table, along with the other main players in the project. Tabbert sat at the table's head, unless useless files spread out before him, a pad pristinely empty, sitting beneath a capped pen. Dr. Clemente, sir, if you would like to begin. Clemente nodded, took a sip of water, then began in a soft professorial voice. We have just completed our 12th week of observation and preliminary treatment of our subject. All requested neurological and brain imaging studies have been completed. He turned to the old German neurologist from the preliminary briefing, Dr. Kapf. Kapf flipped through a file, then closed it before he said a word. We have conducted a full X-ray series as well as a full imaging scan using high-resolution MRI, CT, and CAT technologies. To date, our findings are non-striking. He has no mass lesions, no tumors, no temporal displacement. His brain appears to be of average size with no distinct malformations. There is a small lacunar bruise near the occipital cortex of, in our opinion, childhood origin. However, due to its size, location, and other factors, it has been discounted as a possible factor in the alleged exhibited behavior recorded in the Soviet files. Tabbert waited to be sure that the man had finished. Then, Dr. Kaff, is it your best medical judgment that there is no physiological cause for the violent episodes? Kaff shook his head. Not in the constructs of the brain, no, he paused, not for any of the alleged incidents. Tabbert ignored Kapp's use of alleged. Kapp was an old man, unwilling, in Tabbert's opinion, to let go of old tribal rivalries. He carefully uncapped his pen, made a detailed note, then recapped it, placing it exactly on the pad where it had been. He nodded at Clemente to continue. We have also nearly concluded all of our blood and fluid work. He turned to a man across the table from him. Dr. Gothering? Gothering read from his file. Blood work is normal in all respects, with the exception of declining anemia, which, in our opinion, was due to malnutrition while in the Russians' hands. The condition seems to be correcting itself. In all other respects, we can find no contributory factors to account for any aberrant behaviors. He closed the file and looked down. No contributory factors, Tabbert said as he wrote. Clemente waited for Tabbert to look up, then added, We've run every psych test we can think of on him. Most of them twice, some 3 times. He selected his next words carefully. The results were undramatic. Tabbert immediately looked up. Undramatic, indeed. Everyone at the table could see that he smelled blood. Would you be so kind as to define your terms, Dr. Clemente? Clemente took a deep breath. His IQ tests out at 185, well above genius. He types out as A3, stress vulnerable, impatient, prone to frustration, outbursts, resentments, extremes of emotion. He grades out a 7 of a possible 10 on the Kiernan Violence Index, a rating compatible with the A3 typing. There are no obvious signs of neurosis, psychosis, manias, or dementias. He's not delusional, at least not in the traditional sense. He appears rational, literate, cooperative in a grudging way. Tabbert meticulously uncapped his pen and began to write. He read it back when he finished. The subject, after 12 weeks of full testing, is certified as being well within acceptable parameters of sanity. His behavior, although emotional, is not reflective of any neuropsychiatric condition. That's not what I said, Clemente interrupted in an angry tone. Tabbert looked at him quizzically. No? In what way am I misspeaking? He looked around the table. Has he experienced any violent outbursts? No. Any reversions to primitive behavior? No. Has he exhibited any personality decay, any decompensation or marked lability, mood swings, anything of that type? No. Has he required any medications or restraints? No. The room grew very quiet. Tabbert nodded, recapped the pen, looking pleasantly at Clemente. Then please enlighten us. Clemente wiped his face with a clean handkerchief. I've had 48 clinical sessions with him, approximately 4 a week. The tests might not show anything, but I can assure you there's something there. How? He gestured as he tried to explain. The man is arrogant to the point of absurdity. He seems to have acquired a background in the psychoanalytic technique and revels in allowing only glimpses of the real person beneath the arrogant facade. Tabbert shook his head. Are you sure it is a facade? In my rather substantial experience with intelligence types, I find that their arrogance is more often real than not. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and began to lecture. It is essential to what they do, that they believe they are capable of accomplishing anything, no matter the obstacle. The arrogance, the aviator scarf wrapped once around the throat and blowing in the wind behind him, is more often an actual component of their inner personality. Most definitely not a facade to hide a latent condition. He smiled a satisfied smile. It is typical, not aberrant. Clemente slowly shook his head. Not this time. His voice was rock solid. Tabbert sighed deeply as he began to write and read again. Subject displays unusual personality traits, most likely due to his unusual profession type. I disagree, Clemente said again, this time with the slightest trace of anger. Tabbert capped his pen, locking eyes with Clemente as he did. Dr. Clemente, precisely what conditions or maladies did you— He twisted the next word on his tongue— glimpse beneath the so-called facade. Clemente took a deep breath. He looked down at the table for a very long time. Well, Tabbert pushed, does it, or do they have a name? Clemente exhaled deeply. Not by any conventional definition. The supervising therapist cannot name any specific condition or malady. That Tabbert's interruption was interrupted in kind by Patricia. At least let him finish before you twist his words. Tabbert stared daggers at her. Forgive me, he said in an imperious tone. He turned to Clemente. You may finish, doctor. Clemente looked like he had missed the exchange entirely. He was staring at a window, watching the leaves on a nearby tree blow in the night breeze. Jack, Patricia said softly. He turned back to Tabbert. By any conventional definition, as I said, there is no name. I have never even seen a description of this kind of symptomology in the texts. Tabbert beamed. But, Clemente said sharply, the symptoms and the condition do exist, I'm sure of that. The chief of staff looked down at his notes. I have heard nothing to alter my impressions as stated so far. Therefore, Sir, Patricia said, venom dripping from her politeness. The chief looked at her, pique on his face. I believe I've heard enough, Dr. Nelwyn. Patricia forced up a thin smile. But you haven't heard my report yet, sir. Nor do I intend to. Dr. Clemente speaks for the behavioral unit and for the project. I have what I need. Patricia nodded, an exaggerated nod. I quite understand, sir. She let a momentary look of triumph flash across the chief's face. I'll just submit my report to the review board separately. You will what? Tabbert's face grew instantly red. As the primary therapist on the grant, I have that right. She paused. If you're too busy, I'll just present it to the board myself. Everyone at the table tried to get out of the line of sight between Tabbert and Patricia. A vein started throbbing in his forehead. You may begin, doctor, Tabbert said slowly, with as much control as a furious man could muster. Are you sure? Patricia smiled as she spoke in her sweetest voice. Don't milk it, Jack whispered to her. She opened a file and arranged the papers in front of her. In the past 3 months, I have had 61 conversational sessions with Mr. Newman. They range from a short 20 minutes to a marathon 3.5 hours. While I also have been unable to identify and quantify any reasonable, conventional, or common condition, I fully agree with Dr. Clemente that something is there. And of course you have no evidence of this. Tabbert's voice was snide and biting. On the contrary, she said lightly, I have the pigeon. Tabbert's eyes opened about as wide as they could. What pigeon? Actually, she said as she moved a page from one pile to another, 1 pigeon and 1 cat. It had happened at the end of the 2nd month of Newman's new captivity. The therapy sessions were getting nowhere. The tests were coming back inconclusive or negative. Even the round-the-clock observation of Newman revealed nothing. He appeared to be what he was represented to be, an intelligent saboteur who was suffering only from the expected stresses growing out of his imprisonment by the Russians. And yet, there was something more involved here, some unknown thing, always lurking just beneath the surface, laughing at their inability to find or name it. So a plan had been developed, a plan, risky though it might be, that would administer a sudden psychic shock to Newman. Hopefully, within his reactions to that shock, they would, at the very least, gain a momentary peek at his hidden self. After days of discussion, it was decided that Patricia would lead the experiment. As usual, the door to his quarters was opened at 8:30, and Patricia stepped through. Good morning, she said, as he started to turn around. He froze halfway. The door, always instantly closed behind her, remained open. What are we playing here? He said cautiously. I thought we'd have today's session outside, she'd said pleasantly, and she hoped casually. She didn't think one human being could be so still. He stood there, not moving, not blinking, seeming not even to breathe. Only his eyes moved, slowly going back and forth between her and the open door. Guards? He asked softly. She shrugged. This trip, yes. In the future, we'll see. How many? What are their orders? He slowly turned to face her fully. I'm no expert, she said lightly, but I think it's pretty much like when we brought you down here. If you follow the rules, they'll keep their distance and allow us our session in confidence. His breathing seemed shallow. His muscles were contracted. Everything about the man screamed tension and preparedness. Not that I don't trust you, Doctor, but trust has never exactly worked to my advantage. He licked his lips quickly. Give it to me by the numbers, if you please. Inside, Patricia was rejoicing. This was a Newman they'd never seen before. A man that probably most approximated the man who had been in Russia. His physicality, his tone were new. She prayed that the video was working. Okay, she said in as casual a voice as she could muster. Here's how it works. There are 2 guards outside the door with their guns drawn. We will walk together across the antechamber into the elevator. We will ride to the ground floor together. Alone? She smiled again. Why not? Do I have some reason to be afraid of you? It was almost a full minute before he answered. I haven't decided yet. Was his soft, flat-toned response. Please continue. She ignored the trace of tension she felt building within her. On the ground floor, there will be 2 more guards, also with guns drawn. The corridor between the elevator and the main door will be empty, and we are to proceed directly down it to the main entrance of the unit. Newman seemed to relax slightly. Go on. Patricia shrugged. There's not much to go on with. We go out the door, onto the grounds, and have our session. She turned to leave. Shall we? You left out the rules outside, Doctor. He sounded suspicious. She turned back to him. Common sense. There will be guards and surveillance on us throughout. She hoped he noticed she was including herself. We can go anywhere we like, so long as we stay within 15 meters of the building. She paused. That's it. Newman's mind was racing. Access to the grounds was something he'd been working toward, planning for, praying for. But something wasn't right here. He'd expected a full briefing on rules and conditions before they allowed him out, even for a short period, and that a day or 2 before. This was innately wrong. It briefly crossed his mind that this was a setup, an opportunity for them to shoot him down, quote, trying to escape, unquote. But he had to get outside. He had to get to the outside. It took less than 30 seconds to make his decision. He nodded at Patricia. After you, Doctor. Newman followed her out of his quarters, noting that each of the guards was well out of reach, rock-steady hands pointing their Glock semi-automatic handguns at his head and torso respectively. They were calm, cool, obviously well-trained. As the elevator traveled upward, he reconfirmed his earlier timing of it. New dress? Patricia smiled easily. For the occasion. A spasmodic smile flashed across Newman's face as they stepped out of the elevator. The ground floor was as empty as had been promised, just 2 guards stationed in a stagger down the corridor. Professional, well thought out. Whoever had arranged it worked it out so that even if Newman took out the nearest one, the other one would have more than enough time to cut him down. They walked slowly to the open door. Newman could see the guards spread out in a loose semicircle about 60 meters in front of the building, their Glocks and Schmeissers held casually at their sides. He hesitated, stepping through. It's all right, Patricia urged. Newman ignored her, concentrating instead on the approaching security chief. Good morning, Edel said pleasantly. It seems our prayers have been answered. Newman nodded, depending. Patricia nervously watched the 2 men size each other up. There are no tricks here, sir, Edel said in a sincere voice. If you make no furtive actions, do not attempt to escape or cause harm, my men will keep their distance and not intrude. Otherwise, Edel shrugged. If, by some unexpected stroke of luck, you were able to get past the perimeter, my men on the roof would cut you down before you got 20 meters. His voice was matter-of-fact. Newman looked at the ceiling above him, picturing the snipers that Edel had expertly placed. His opinion of the German security chief grew by the minute. He smiled at Edel. I praise thee, for thou art fearful and wonderful. Wonderful are thy works, thou knowest me right well. Edel grinned as he nodded. You have been reading your Bible. Psalms, Newman said lightly. 139 or 14. He smiled. It helps pass the time. Thank you. It was my pleasure. He started to turn away, then stopped, turning back to Newman. Perhaps we could discuss your reading sometime? I'd like that. Edel nodded, half bowed to Patricia, then left to join his men. Slowly, Newman stepped out into the sun, gratefully accepting the offered sunglasses from Patricia. For 10 minutes, they walked around the building. Newman seemed calm and relaxed, breathing the clean, fresh air deeply, quietly taking it all in. Patricia was becoming exhilarated. Newman seemed authentically relaxed and loose for the first time. Cautious, tentative early steps soon became full, comfortable strides. At one point, he even crouched down under a tree on the west side of the building. She hoped he wasn't being overwhelmed by the experience. He wasn't. All of his defenses were going full out, set off by what he observed under this tree. He compared the grass, the color, its uprightness to the grass around it. He looked for and found the location of the nearest sprinkler heads and estimated how the water from them would fall on this area. After 2 minutes, his suspicion was confirmed. Many times in the recent past, perhaps nightly, after the sprinklers shut off at midnight and before the morning dew, someone had crouched on this spot, crouched and remained for a period of hours, probably concealed by a night camouflage cloak or boulder net, judging by the marks on the ground. And that someone had not wanted to be detected by Edel's security force. A new piece to the slowly evolving puzzle that Newman was mentally assembling. He stood up and stretched. Patricia relaxed as she saw a content expression on his face. Shall we begin? He nodded. As long as we can keep walking, I need the exercise. And a closer look around the rest of the perimeter, he thought. We were talking about anger. Were we? She smiled. We were. A pause. How do you feel about that? Newman laughed. Anger or talking about anger? When she didn't answer, he went on. A waste of time, really. Why? Well, he said slowly, define anger. How would you define it? She responded quickly. Newman stopped, turning to face her. Forget the perfect clinical response for once. He was smiling his charming smile. Just answer the question. Okay. She thought for a moment. A strong passion or emotion of displeasure and usually antagonism, excited by a sense of injury or insult. She paused. How'd I do? He clapped lightly. Brava, except you left out a couple of things. Such as, anger is an active emotion, unlike its opposite sentiment, calm, which is passive by definition. He crouched down to examine the grass. Anger saps energy, raises blood pressure, cuts down the flow of oxygen to the brain, increases the heart rate, contracts the major muscle groups, generally debilitates the body in a painfully short time. Patricia nodded as he stood and moved on. But what about it serving as a release? She asked. Anger unexpressed can be even more harmful. She studied his manner carefully as he seemed to think about it. I disagree. Really? He smiled and laughed lightly. It's not the suppression of the anger that's harmful. It's the fact that the root cause remains unchained when, most often, anger is checked at the door. You lost me, she said honestly. He sat down on the grass, a spot where he could see through a parting in the trees in the woods. She sat down beside him. By your own definition, he began as he appeared to be looking at her. Anger is a response to a sense of injury or insult, right? Go on. Well, he said, while trying to see through the opening in the woods. More often than not, when we give our anger voice, through its fury or hurt or pain, it begins to resolve the problem. She nodded. A necessary thing, yes? Agreed. But why allow all that pain and anguish and physiological chaos? He noticed a cat about to pounce on a pigeon. Patricia followed his gaze. He continued speaking as the cat jumped, hitting the pigeon in the wing. The injured bird managed to make it to a low branch of a nearby tree. Why allow all that shit to bubble up inside you when you can avoid it by just addressing the problem up front? He looked over at Edel and pointed at the pigeon. Okay if I check that out? Edel nodded and redeployed his men, keeping the bulk of them between Newman and the woods. Newman and Patricia, closely watched by the guards, moved toward the injured bird in the tree. If you address a problem through anger, Newman went on, your judgment is impaired. You tend to do more or less than you really need to do. He stopped 10 feet from the tree. Don't move, he said softly. Patricia watched in fascination as Newman moved slowly, almost gracefully, forward, and reached up toward the injured bird. Everything about him was calm, cool, relaxed, unthreatening. The bird seemed to sense this and didn't resist as he gently lifted it off the branch. He gently stroked the pigeon's feathers. Wings broken, he said in a soft, soothing voice. He turned to Patricia. When something is in pain and no one gives a shit about it, that offends me, insults, and injures me. He shrugged, but I don't get angry, I deal with it. Patricia watched as Newman grabbed the bird by its head, gave it a quick twist, snapping its neck more quickly than she could fathom. He dropped the instantly dead bird to the ground. The guards flinched. Edel nodded. Patricia stood transfixed. Newman started back toward the unit. A moment later, Patricia followed. He continued speaking as if nothing had happened. No anger, no rage, he said coolly. Just observation. I saw the bird attacked but not killed. Analysis. I saw that it was in pain and could not recover from its wounds. And finally, action. I put it out of its pain. The cat walked up to them, rubbing against Newman's legs. He looked down at it and smiled. I felt no more anger at that bird than he did, he said, nodding at the cat. Of course, he suddenly raised his foot and smashed it down on the cat's head, crushing its skull. Its body lay twitching on the grass for several moments before it became still. Newman looked over at an ashen-faced Patricia. Of course, he said casually, cats really piss me off.